In this first video for Module 18, we consider characteristics of arid landscapes. So let's take a look at this word arid. What does arid mean? Well, most scientists use something called the aridity index to represent arid regions on the planet. And the aridity index considers precipitation, P, divided by potential evapotranspiration, or PET. And potential evapotranspiration considers things like humidity, solar radiation received, and wind. We know that PET is higher during the summer, on days that are less cloudy, and during windy conditions. So, if you consider a map of precipitation divided by potential evapotranspiration, we can see some places are extremely arid. Those areas that are called, that are referred to as hyperarid, shown here in red. And then we have some other areas that fall into the categories of arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid. Let's consider now the diversity of arid landscapes. We're going to sort of take a tour, if you will, of the world and look at some types of arid lands. Some places like the Sahara's Irq Chebi in Morocco are just a sea of sand, and they sure look arid. Other places are more dominated by weathering processes, like these natural pyramids in Egypt. And yet others are covered entirely by rock, something we call hamada, like the Valley of Fire in southern Nevada. Then some are pretty unusual, like this area of China with these very, very colorful rock and minerals. And other areas are pretty mountainous, like this part of northwest Chad. We don't really think about really mountainous areas in Central Africa. And we should probably also throw in polar deserts, which would, in some measures, be the very driest places on the planet. This is Antarctica's Right Valley. Let me walk through just for a moment some characteristics of arid land, some things that we would expect to see in not every arid landscape, but most arid landscapes. And the first of those is weathering. Weathering is particularly dominant in younger deserts that are going through a process of weathering where rock is broken up. We can see here, this is a view from Utah. Another dominant feature of arid landscapes is creep, and that's where sand and other lighter materials are picked up and carried by sand and transported, sometimes in a very inconvenient way, like covering this roadway or filling up this old building with sand. Some other characteristics: soil and regolith. Regolith is that sort of transition material between solid bedrock and soil. It's sort of an in-betweener kind of material. So you might think of it as soil in development. And then we have surfaces like this in some arid regions, that just rocky surfaces where many of these the lighter materials have been picked up and carried away. Arid landscapes also are characterized by impermeable surfaces like this one. This is the slick rock country of Utah. And you'll find places like this in Canyonlands National Park in Utah. Fabulous places if you like to mountain bike. So impermeable surfaces are those that don't allow water to easily pass through them. And here's another view of Canyonlands National Park in Utah. And of course we have sand. And we tend to think of arid landscapes and sand as sort of going together, but as you can see from some of these previous slides, there are a lot of arid landscapes that really aren't covered by sand. But these ergs are really quite interesting. And here's some sort of a comparison of sands that you might find in the Algerian Sahara to a sand that's closer to the Red Sea, a whiter in color, and then the sand that's around the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. Rainfall, when we do see rainfall, or when we do have rainfall events, they often are pretty dramatic. So you might have a very, a massive downpour in a desert area, and then no rainfall for long periods of time. And oftentimes you have flash floods in arid environments as well. Drainage is another characteristic. This is what's called a wadi, or a drainage area in Morocco. So it's kind of a dry area, a river channel, if you will, that may only have water in it during a portion of the year, and another dry area near Phoenix, Arizona. Wind is also a characteristic of arid landscapes, and many of our service personnel who've been over in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East can attest to the horrible sand and windstorms that are sometimes experienced in those places. What's interesting about in this scene showing an erg or sea of sand is that the sand is picked up and carried, but generally it's transported within just a few inches of the surface. We also have basins of interior drainage, and these are places where water flows down to locations where there's no way for it to eventually flow into a river that would take it to an ocean. So places like Death Valley, when water flows down into Death Valley, the only way for the water to escape is through evaporation. And oftentimes we have salts that are left behind, so we have these very dry basins of interior drainage. Another is the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And this is actually a view of the Dead Sea that separates Israel from Jordan on the southern part of the Dead Sea. This is the lowest place in terms of elevation on our planet, over 1,200 feet below sea level. And then vegetation, it tends to be pretty sparse, like these prickly pear cactus. The competition among plants is pretty severe for moisture, and this organ pipe cactus. Just a quick tour and look at the world's deserts. I've marked the big ones on here. There are a lot of smaller ones, but these are the major deserts of each continent: the Gobi in Central Asia, the Sahara, North Africa, the Kalahari in South Africa. And then looking at the U.S., we've got the Great Basin, which is the largest desert in North America, the Mojave. This is only a partial list. The Atacama in South America, the Patagonian Desert, and then we have a few deserts in Australia as well, the Great Victoria and the Simpson. So just a look at just some of the deserts. There are many more that aren't that we're not going to look at here, but just a kind of a comparison so you can see the tremendous diversity of the way deserts look. We have the very red sands of the Simpson Desert. That's because of a lot of iron that's in those sand particles, and then the Great Victoria Desert with significantly more vegetation. The driest desert on the planet that's outside of Antarctica is this one here, the Atacama Desert in Argentina. Some places in the Atacama have never received recorded rainfall of any type. And this is a view, one of my photos from the salt plain of the Atacama Desert, a place where they mine the material that's used to produce lithium for lithium batteries. They pump water out from below the salt plain, allow it to evaporate, and then they mine that material to produce lithium. Another view of the Atacama Desert. This is a place where when NASA was considering sending a rover to Mars, and even before that, rovers to the Earth's moon, they visited the Atacama Desert and used that as something that sort of simulated what might be experienced on the surface of the moon and later the surface of Mars. The largest desert in the world, the Sahara. This is sort of incorrectly, this slide is incorrectly labeled because they say Sahara Desert. Sahara means desert in Arabic, but it's a massive desert stretching all the way across North Africa. And not all of it looks like this. This is sort of a representative view of the border between Morocco and Algeria, the Sea of Sand. Some of it is more vegetated. The Kalahari Desert and the Namib Desert in southern Africa, the Kalahari covering parts of Botswana and South Africa. These deserts are, well, the Kalahari is particularly dry, so is the Namib Desert. And here's a view of what they look like with sort of those red sands, some vegetation. The Gobi Desert in Central Asia that sort of straddles China and Mongolia. And one of my photos from central Mongolia on a trip I took there several years ago. A pretty dry place, not as dry as some other deserts that we'll talk about. So how many deserts, how many U.S. deserts can you name? Can you name them all? And there's more than just the Mojave. So let's take a look at a map of the U.S. and see how you do. So, well, the biggest one that I pointed out already, and the one that's probably one of the least known, is the Great Basin. And this pretty much covers much of Utah, parts of Nevada. It's a massive desert that has mountain ranges separated by flat valley floors that just seem to go on forever. So the Great Basin is just a massive desert. The Mojave is one of the better known deserts. This is the one that contains Death Valley National Park, found in California and Nevada. And then did you guess the Sonora Desert that's found outside of cities like Tucson, Arizona? This is Saguaro Cactus or Saguaro National Park outside of Tucson, Arizona. And then the Chihuahua Desert that extends down into Mexico. So these are the major deserts of the U.S. There's some smaller places that are pretty dry, but these are the big ones. And just a final look at sort of the contrast between the Great Basin Desert, Mojave, Sonora, and Chihuahuan Desert. They're infinitely different in terms of their appearance and also in terms of vegetation and other characteristics.